Welcome to another edition of Digging Deeper. My name is Bradley Martin, Pastor Bradley Martin, Dr. Martin, whatever you are so inclined to refer to me as. I welcome you. We are, best by my count, in session 12 of the study of the book of Acts. We're going to be looking at chapter number 17 today. I am joining you from a hotel room today, so if it looks funny, that is the reason why I am doing volleyball officiating in the middle of Orlando. And it is not as fun as it sounds. I had a little bit of time off this afternoon, so I wanted to jump on and get this recorded so you will have this study for this coming week. So again, I am excited that you are joining us today. This is your first time, welcome. If this is the manyth time that you've been here, we like to appreciate you for joining us here on the show. This is, let me just remind you, this is also available in podcast form. So if you want to subscribe to that, please do so. If you want to share this with others, please get the word out that we're digging a little bit deeper than we could necessarily on a Sunday morning. And this is just a time that we can do that. And again, just let me remind you, I haven't done this in a few weeks, I don't think. If questions come up or comments you want to make, please leave those comments in the in the comments section, whether you'll be watching this on our Facebook channel or on our YouTube channel. I'm sure you can do this on the podcast as well. So please do that. I would love to interact with you and answer questions that you may have. With all that being said, let's jump right into it. Today we're going to be looking at chapter number 17, the book of Acts. Paul and Silas will be traveling to Thessalonica, Berea, and to Athens. And so let me read the first part, and then I'll kind of show you in context where this is on the map there in the ancient times. Let me get my face out of the way so you can read all this. All right, chapter 17. This is divided into about 3 sections, so chunked up a little bit here. So if it's too small to read, again, you please join us in your own. You can feel free to look at here at the scripture, or you can read along with us in the book of Acts. I am reading as typical from the English Standard Version. Just join us there if you will, if you are so inclined to do so. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews, and Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, and did a great many of the devout Greeks, but not all, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some of the wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob and set a city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. A couple of things here as we start. I want to show you this again on the map. You can see here on the right-hand side again, if you just joined us for the first time, that Paul has left from Antioch. He has taken along with him Silas's time. I won't reteach this, but Paul and Barnabas was the original missionaries, if you will, that was sent on the first journey. They had a disagreement, including a disagreement with John Mark. So they split ways. Now Paul and Silas are traveling on this trek across Lower Asia, basically. If you would look at it modern day, they are crossing now. That they crossed the sea last week. They were in Neapolis and Philippi. Of course, we looked last week when Paul and Silas were arrested in Philippi, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit as a kind of a cross-reference in Paul's letters. But this week we're looking at Amphipolis. I'm not really sure how you say that. Apollonia, and now we're going to Berea and Thessalonica, or actually to Thessalonica and to Berea in that order. Excuse me. He's going to eventually make his way to Corinth, which you see at the bottom of Greece. So this area right here is modern day Greece. You see Macedonia. Last week we looked at, I believe it was last week, we looked at Paul getting a vision from a man that said, come over into Macedonia. This is that area in Macedonia, modern day Greece. Just remember, please, that Greece, the Greek Empire was the big empire until the Romans took over right before the turn of the calendar. We kind of refer to, well, we do refer to the flipping of the calendar from what was BC into AD in our modern vernacular. Some people want to use BCE and CE as being before Common Era and Common Era. But really what the central point of that was time flipped around Jesus. So don't ever confuse that, or don't ever let anybody try to talk you out of the fact that he is the one that we tell time by. And so just a little side note there. But Paul and Silas they've left Philippi, they've gone through Amphipolis, and Apollonia, and now are into Thessalonica. And I want to cross-reference a little bit of this with the book of Thessalonians, First and Second Thessalonians, which Paul wrote, as well as one of his letters to the church in Thessalonica. And so you have all these things that are kind of both repeat of many of the other areas that Paul has done, but also there's a cross-reference in this historically, because we know that these places exist. We know that these things happen historically, and we also have multiple sources inside of our canonized scripture, inside the Bible itself, that we see that these are not just things that people just grabbed out of thin air and just stuck in a book hoping that they would stick. These are actually historically traced documents. And so Paul here, as was his custom, Paul and Silas and Timothy is escorting him as well. And of course Luke, who is the author of the book of Acts, is also with him. There's several in the traveling party here, but as you can see, very early in this section, in verse number 2, Paul has this custom of going into the Sabbath, into the synagogue, to meet with the Jews. And verse 2 says he did this for 3 Sabbaths, so he did it for 3 weeks. And he reasoned with them from the scriptures. And Paul is not necessarily arguing here, but he is a serious debate between those, because you have this pantheistic, meaning multiple religions going on here. If you go back and you study Grecian history, you know that they have many gods that they worshipped. And when Rome took over, they brought in their theology, their gods, all these with a small g, not to be confused with our God, Jehovah. But you have all these things that are kind of intertwining now. And of course, Rome is in charge, and you still have the history of Greece and all their theological things that they brought with them historically. And so now you find Paul inside of the synagogue teaching about the Christ, and how it was necessary for Christ to come and to suffer and then to rise from the dead. He says point blank, this Jesus that I'm telling you about, I'm proclaiming, is the Christ. He is the Messiah. There is no doubt. You don't see a lot of theology that is written here inside of this historical document. And so I don't think Paul spent a lot of time going very theologically deep in this. I really believe that he taught Jesus day after day, how it was necessary that Jesus, that all these signs pointed to Jesus. And he did this in many of the other places that he went. And so it was his custom, as you read throughout the book of Acts, and again throughout his letters, where he just point blank talks to them about Jesus. Now, some of them, as it says here in verse 4, some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas. You'll see these names throughout, and the references back to them. So many devout Greeks, and it says not a few of the leading women, and so you have conversion of some of the Greeks here. Um, but again, remember that there's a kind of, I can't think of a better way to say it, but there's a big hodgepodge of people here. You have Greeks, you have Jews, you have Jewish Greeks, you have Romans, you have Jews that were of the same um, kind that crucified Jesus. You have Jews that have become believers, have become Christians, and followed in the teachings of Jesus. And so you have all of these things going on. But when it says, but the Jews, we're talking about those Jews that would have been all these anti-Jesus Jews, if you will. So being a Jew necessarily is not what he's referring to as being kind of the bad set of people, but he's really going back to those who are anti-Christ, who are anti-Jesus, the ones who originally arrested Jesus, the ones that put him on trial, the those the ones even throughout the first of the book of Acts, where they did the same things to Peter and the John. They put him in a prison. It would have been pre-conversion for Paul/Saul. Those types of people um, who are not seeing these things in the way that Jesus is is now sending us all out to spread the gospel. And so you have this mob that's formed that is coming after Paul and Silas and company. One of the things that I've seen throughout this and looking at historically Rome, um, or really any type of um, power that is in control, if you have the way that a country or a power takes over another country is they invade them, they take away their will to fight back, they take away all sense of pride, all sense of individuality, and so they become part of the Roman Empire. But when you have this mob mentality, you have the thought of an uproar. You go back to when Jesus was um, on trial and Jesus was eventually crucified. One of the concerns that the Jews had was that Rome would come in and squash them because they couldn't control their own people. And so the people that they had left in charge, those leading Jews, those council of the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and whatnot, those are really kind of trying to stay away from a mob. And now you see they're actually forming a mob so that they can come and get all these people back out. And so we're introduced to this person named Jason. Jason was a person where Paul was um, ultimately able to start a fellowship, a church, if you will, in his house. And of course, in this case, Paul and Silas were with them, and so they dragged out Jason and his family before the authorities. They key phrase here is that they accuse them of turning the world upside down. And don't miss that phrase. I did some reading on that today before I started recording this. Um, Looking at the world upside down. That's a phrase that has been used, and some of it's kind of been used flippantly. But go back to the teachings of Jesus. Go back to the beginnings of the teachings, like in Matthew 4 and 5, the Beatitudes, where he talks about hey, if someone hits you on the right hand side, turn your cheek and let them hit the other side. Or if they steal one cloak, give them your coat as well. Those kinds of thinking are kind of flipping. They're looking at the world upside down. When the rich young ruler came to Jesus and wanted to become a follower of Jesus, he said, "Go and sell everything you have." And so that's a flip way to think about things. One would think that, hey, I need to do everything that I can to build up my earthly treasures. And Jesus is here saying, nope, the way you get to me is to get rid of all that, give it away, and then follow me, because all that other stuff gets in the way. So we're we're upside down thinking now. We're flipping the world upside down. But when you flip the world upside down in your own thinking, this kind of thinking is no longer flipped upside down. It is the right way of looking at it. When you're flipped upside down and when you're looking at things through the lens of Jesus, then you're no longer looking at it through the lens of the world. The lens of the world, for instance, says, hey, make all the money you can, store it all, save it all, build 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 bigger barns, as the teachings were, store it all for a rainy day, where the lens to Jesus may be in fact the opposite. Give it away. Help those who are in need. Don't store things here on earth where moth and rust and decay happen. So they've been accused of flipping the world upside down. They're being accused of acting against the decrees of Caesar. They're proclaiming that there's another king whose name is Jesus. Of course, what is ultimately the thought here is that Jesus at that time, they wanted, before Jesus was crucified, they wanted him to establish an earthly kingdom. They were ready to fight for him. Peter, other other of the disciples at the time were ready to lay down, to pick up their weapons and fight. Peter, even to the point in the garden when the arrest happened, Peter was ready. He cut off the servant's ear. He was ready to go to war. But Jesus said, I'm not establishing this kingdom here. And so the fact that they're still accusing Jesus this many years later in the book of Acts to go against Caesar. We've already gone through this stuff. They accused Jesus years before this of doing the same thing, and they accused Jesus of not rendering to Caesar the taxes. So they wanted, that was their go-to when it came to, hey, let's get him. Was it's anti-Caesar. Because if you were anti-Caesar, then you were dead. They were coming after you. They would not let anybody get an uprising or a following that could try to overthrow the government. Because again, the easiest way to keep your kingdom is to squash all the other stuff. I think I taught this a couple weeks ago. That's why we had the cross. That's why Romans used the cross. It wasn't just to say, hey, we kill you, because they could have stabbed him. They could have put a spear through him. They could have done so much easier. They'd been so much quicker. But a cross would have been torture for the person to go through, but also would have been a visualization, or visual, that's what I'm looking for, a visual of torture and suffering for everybody else to see. So they wouldn't do that. So, it says in verse 8, and the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And so they basically took money as a security from Jason and the rest, and they let him go. So there's this craziness that's going on in Thessalonica. I wanted to read just a little snippet of the First Thessalonians. Um, I think it was in verse number 2. I mean, chapter number 2. So he starts here, for you yourselves know, brothers, that our coming to you was not in vain, but we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know. We had the boldness in our God to declare for you the gospel in the midst of much conflict, for our appeal does not spring up from error or impurity or any attempt to deceive, but just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak not to please men, but to please God who tests our hearts. So you have this thought. This is exactly when this is happening. Okay. So Paul is writing this, and most scholars think that he wrote these letters while he was in Corinth, which is coming up. But it's, again, it doesn't really matter. It's about the same time frame. Don't get too caught up in those details that don't matter. And First Thessalonians is going through all these things about the suffering, but is looking ahead at the coming, at the returning of the Lord. And so that's a passage that is read a lot of the times in for funerals. He talks about, that we have hope, that we have all this stuff, that the day of the Lord is coming. And I wanted to let's see, yeah, in verse number 15, again, this is the same Paul who's going through this stuff in Thessalonica, and he's going through this mob mentality. He's writing back to this church that he has established in Thessalonica. He writes this in First Thessalonians 5, 15 and following. See that no one repays any evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. So as we kind of move from Thessalonica here, you can see the suffering that Paul and Silas and company are going through. You can see the suffering that some of the ones that are following them are also having to go through here with Jason. So let's move on to Berea. So in verse 10, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. When they had arrived they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of the Lord was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, there came two agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way by the sea, but to Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and having received the command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So put this visual here together. So Paul and Silas. So there's these. Paul and Silas have established what we consider a church. They're referred to as the brothers. They're referred to as different things here, but ultimately they are this church that Paul and Silas have established here. They are so concerned with what's going on in Thessalonica that the brothers are sending Paul and Silas by night and sending them on to Berea. Again, this is Paul's calling. to do. So Paul and Silas are sharing the gospel. Go back to Acts 1:8, to the uttermost parts of the earth. So their concept of the uttermost parts of the earth is where they're going. Now, in 2024, we know that we, as in us, we are United States centralized. And so we have the mindset that we are going from this area out to the world, and we have many people who are going to different places in the world and sharing the gospel. Africa, South America, China, those types of places. They didn't know this place existed in this time frame, the middle of the first century. There's no Christopher Columbus that has gone to discover America. There's no whatever other explorers you want to refer to that are coming in the next thousands of years. But really, this all started with Paul. So Paul and the believers here were Jerusalem centered. So we are United States centered. Specifically our church in South Carolina and Seneca. But this is not remanded to those specifically. It is to the to the uttermost parts of the world. So here Paul and Silas, with the knowledge that everywhere they've gone, there's been trouble, right? So every time that they go somewhere, even though there's something good that happens, there's people that are healed, there's people that receive the gospel, there's always this group of Jews that are referred to as Jews that are trying to follow them and squash them. So they are trying to stay ahead of them. Paul and Silas have been sent to Berea, where they're also going to share the gospel. Again, as Paul's custom was, he went into the Jewish the synagogue. And this time they found Jews that were more noble, so they were more receptive of hearing the gospel. They weren't as others that they have talked to, so they received the word with all eagerness. They took the time daily to examine the scriptures to see if these things were so. Again, it's not, when you look at something and test it, it's not a bad thing. And so, like, for instance, if you're listening to me talk about this today, I appreciate your faith in me. I appreciate, I know Pastor Joel appreciates his faith in him whenever he preaches. And you should trust us. You should trust that we've studied and put in the time, and put in the prayer time and the time with God, so that we can deliver these things. But testing them to make sure that we're true has two benefits. One is it makes sure that it's true, but the second and probably most important is that it allows you to grow in your scripture. And so when you're reading through all the stuff, studying for yourself, you learn more. And so these people were daily examining, and they were studying the scriptures to see if these things were correct. Many of them, those Jews that were in Thessalonica, believed, and so the gospel is being spread. There's people being converted. I find it interesting. Again, we're referring to the Greek women of high standing, as well as men. That's just kind of makes me chuckle there. But you have these Jews that have finally made it from Thessalonica, who, in my visual here, they're chasing Paul and Silas wherever they go off to. They're kind of that rogue group of bandits, if you will, that are trying to follow them, because they know their job is to stop this by whatever reason or manner that they can do that. And so what they're doing is agitating and stirring up the crowd. So they're making this mob mentality, that Paul and Silas are trying to avoid. Paul and Silas are not coming into every city with great pomp and circumstance. There's no parade. There's no, hey, look, we're here. The greatest evangelist who's taught, who has written all these letters, who of course now we know has written the majority of the New Testament, but they didn't have that then. But this Paul is not writing in on a cult. He's not letting, I mean, he's trying to do what he's doing. He's going into the synagogue and he's meeting the Jews head on, and he's teaching them, hey, what you've been teaching them is right only when you look at it through the lens of Jesus. When you take away Jesus, everything is wrong. Um, he's not turning the scriptures upside down. He's actually inserting and looking through the eyes of Jesus here. And that's really what it's all about. So you have this uproar again, this agitation. So the brothers decided to all right, we're sending Paul off. So we're going to send him on to Athens. But they allow Silas and Timothy to stay there for a time to continue to establish and to make sure everything is being taught correctly. That is a great point to note here, that this is not Paul centric. While Paul is um the main character that we have as far as the New Testament goes in spreading the gospel, it is not Paul only that's doing, or Paul is not the only one that's available or able to do this kind of stuff. You have, in this case, Silas and Timothy, who have been left behind for a small amount of time, there to do the work in Berea, to help continue to establish the church, to help to teach, to help to do all those things that Paul would have done if Paul was still there. But the brothers felt it wise for them to send Paul on to Athens. And then, of course, Silas and Timothy are going to join him soon. So now we're in Athens. So Athens, Greece, um, cultural capital of the world at the time. So now when Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city that was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Repeat of everything that has happened. He is so consistent in everything that he's done. So he's waiting for them to arrive in Athens, but he's not sitting on his backside not doing anything. So he recognizes that you have all of these things going on in Athens. Now, everything that has been going on everywhere else has been a problem. You have this cultural, diverse cultural thing going on where all these people are happening. Well, now you're in the cultural center of the world. Now, whereas Rome was the power, Athens is kind of seen as that cultural, um, those places where all these people and all these gods and all these idols and everything was kind of here. And so you have these marketplaces, where people would come in every day. Paul went back to the synagogue as his consistent choice of modus operandi, if you will, was every day he went into, every time he went into a new place, he went into the synagogue to teach to the Jews. And he wanted to go not only to teach the Jews about Jesus, but then he wanted to go out to where all the common people were, in this case, the marketplace. So that's exactly where he went. So some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. So you have these smart, intelligent philosophers that are now talking. And Paul's not a dummy. Paul is, by Paul's history, Paul was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He knew, he was taught under Gamaliel. So he knew. So when they said, what does this blabber wish to say? Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So you have this commencing of ideological differences, of theological differences, of cultural differences. You have all these places that are here where Paul is now about to teach and about to preach Jesus. These philosophers would have recognized the multiple teachings of the world, the multiple religions of the world, the multiple gods of both the Grecian history, but also the Roman history. So you have all this stuff going on, excuse me, and so they decided to take Paul and bring him to the Areopagus. Hope I'm saying that right. So this place is basically a big rock on the side of a hill. It is where these kind of exchanges of philosophies and arguments happen every day. You've heard some of us, I know Pastor Joel has mentioned when he was in seminary, you would have this. I witnessed the same kind of things with people when they had these, when they had sort of just time to sit at cafes or whatever. And I'm sure it's a lot bigger now and a bigger scenario now, because more people are just sitting around drinking coffee and talking, I guess. But they just like to argue that they, Pastor says all the time that they like to argue whether or not Jesus could sin. Um, I used to get asked a lot about my theological basis, and just not really for the knowledge to know, but just to label. And so this was that type of place where all of these arguments and debates would happen about really nothing. And so there's a Areopagian council that they have, but the Areopagus is basically a big rock outside of Athens where these people would go and just talk. It is called Areopagus in Greek. You've heard it referred to probably in the Roman side of the world as Mars Hill. And so there, Areopagus, after the Greek god Ares, which was the god of war, Mars, the Roman god of war, and so that's where these kind of things. Everything in ancient Greece and ancient Rome was typically named after one of their gods. We follow the same kind of stuff today in our Roman calendar. So here we have Paul being brought to the Areopagus and is about to start teaching. May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. They're just asking for. You seem strange to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, that what these things mean. Now, all of the Athenians and foreigners who live there would spend their time nothing except telling or hearing something new. So you have this sense of there's nothing really happening. It's just you just want to get the latest stuff. The latest stuff, it really doesn't mean much of anything in the grand scheme of things. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Now, this is a true statement. They are very religious. There's hundreds of gods. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation and mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find them. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. as even some of your own poets have said, for we indeed his offspring. Being this God's offspring, we ought not to think that um the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. And the times of ignorance and the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world is righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now, when they heard this of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So when Paul went out from amongst their midst, so Paul went out from their midst, and some men joined and believed, having also whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite, and women named Damaris and others with him. Um, again, Paul, his mission was to spread the gospel. His mission, his initial mission is to spread the word of Jesus Christ to the world. So he is going out to these places that are, and you notice that the farther he gets away from Antioch and Jerusalem, the more these people are away from what you and I would consider um, Jewish custom, Jewish culture. And so now he is standing in the midst of Athens, and the most diverse culture in the world. And now he's teaching them, and he's using them. Ironically, he's using an inscription that they have of what they are referring to as an unknown God. So they recognize that there's this God that they recognize, they sense his presence, they sense the need to worship him, but they can't name him, they can't do anything but say, here is an altar with an inscription, just, and we're gonna call it to the unknown God. But Paul is using that as you know, he's flipping the script here, and he's inserting Jesus into this, or God, the Jehovah, into this by way of Jesus Christ and his death and resurrection. God is not in temples made by man. So he is not in all those temples and all those things that they have built throughout the history of Greece. God doesn't live in those types of things. God lives in man. He is he is he's not that, he says he's actually not far from each one of us. He's inside of us. So that is what 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 we have here as the message that Paul has shared. Now, before I close, look at the results of this. So you have um, Dionysius and Damaris. Damaris was a woman. Dionysius was a man of the Areopagite. He was one of the ones that was in this council. He was probably one of the ones that was in the time where they just like to argue, they just like to talk, they just like to argue, to trade philosophies. And now you have this man whom I look at in the same vein as Nicodemus was to the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees. So now you have one of their own that has come to know Jesus, um, and recognize how that is the catalyst and how the gospel is spread. So now we have Paul. Again, just a quick recap. We've gone through Thessalonica, we read a little bit in First Thessalonians. Again, we have the letters, First and Second Thessalonians. Things didn't go well ultimately there. They were things didn't go well there. So they went off to Berea. You had some of the same things there, but even in all those bad things and all those things, you had a pocket full of people that found out about the gospel, that heard the gospel for the first time because Paul and Silas were faithful. Paul, Silas, and Timothy were all faithful to keep sharing that word even through their suffering. And then ultimately, Paul comes here as we finish for this session to Athens, where he is again the most diverse culture at that time in the world, where all these things are kind of coming together at crossroads. And here he's able to share on the Areopagus. Um, he's sharing the stage that many other worldly worldly philosophers have shared, where they just teach about really nothing. And here you have, excuse me, Paul and Silas, or Paul in particular. Paul is able to share the gospel here to all these people in the marketplace and on the Areopagus here. He's able to share them about Jesus. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapter 17. Next time we will look in the chapter 18. Paul will be in Corinth. We'll look a little bit in First and Second Corinthians about how that kind of relates to it. Paul is going to return to Antioch and following there as well. So again, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, maybe you don't have a concern, but if you have any comments or anything, questions that you want to share with us, please do so. If not, let me pray for you and we will end the session again for this week. God, thank you for another time that we can have to study your word. I pray that the seeds that we planted tonight would go forth and be plentiful and bountiful in the harvest. Protect us all, guide us and direct us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. I hope you have a great week, and we will see you on the next time.